All right, so first thing, if at any point today you have a question, comment, concern, stop me and just say, hey, professor, I have a question, comment, or concern. Um, so today, literally all we're going to be talking about today, I don't know how much of today's class we're going to use, whether we'll end early, whether we're going to run long. I really don't know. This class is for all of you, so however long it takes works for me. So basically, I want to talk about writing papers because every professor in anything that isn't math generally says go write a paper, but not many of them take the time to say what the hell they're looking for. And it seems like every one of us is looking for something a little bit different. And we all have our own views and we're all sticklers for things. So I want to take the time to say exactly what I'm looking for. And more importantly, talk about why I think the things I'm looking for are valuable and talk about what I'm looking for in philosophy papers that is applicable outside of just writing papers for a philosophy class. So first things first, like very basic question, which you all on some level know the answer to, but worth talking about anyway. Why on earth do professors ask people to write papers? What is the point of it? And that's a literal question. Why the hell do people like me ask you all to write papers?
You want to make sure that we understand the material.
Yeah, it's to make sure you understand the material. So that's one aspect, is to make sure you understand the material. But secondly, paper writing is of any sort is tied in with skills which get used outside of an academic setting. Like it's basically the sorts of paper writing that you're doing in a philosophy class is basically similar to many of the things you do in a job application. In a philosophy class, you're trying to say, here's my thesis and here's why it's right. When you're writing a cover letter, you have a thesis too. Your thesis is, you should hire me for this job and here's why. So these are not skills that like exist in a vacuum. Also, the other thing is, very often you think you understand something until you try to teach it to somebody else. And then you very quickly realize that you did not understand things nearly as well as you thought you did. Has anyone ever had this experience? You try to describe to a friend something you learned in class because they just find it interesting, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, crap, I don't fully understand what it is I was talking about after all. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had this experience. But so that's why we're doing it. Now, what separates a philosophy paper from other papers, or what is the goal of a philosophy paper? Well, the goal is, I'm going to write it in red since it's down here. So every paper has a purpose, but what the purpose is going to depend on what class you're writing it for and what the point is. So for this class, you're trying to write a reasoned defense of some claim. That is not the same as writing a poem. In a poem, your goal is to entertain, to make someone feel something. In this class, your goal is to pick some claim, defend that claim in such a way that, and you defend it with reasons. You do not threaten somebody's life. You do not accuse them of being a bad person if they don't believe you. You instead give them reasons to think what you're saying is true. And everything you're doing is geared towards that. You pick some particular claim in response to one of the prompts. You then choose to make that your core, and everything else in the paper is several pages designed to show somebody that that claim that you're arguing for is the correct thing to think on that particular topic. That's all it is in terms of what I'm looking for with reasoned defense of some claim, and that's how to think of your paper. In some ways, it's the same as you would be defending yourself in anything else, or explaining why you should go to dinner at this place as opposed to that place. It's nothing too complicated. What sets it apart is that you're writing it down, and that the topic that you're arguing about, instead of something like, should we get tacos or pizza, is something like, should you believe the classical theory of concepts? So any questions thus far on just the general big picture sorts of goals of the paper? All right. In that case, what I want to say is, how do you go about writing it? So the way to think about it is there's two main things you have to worry about is what should the ultimate product be structured like? Because very often professors tell you go write a paper, but we don't tell you what a good paper looks like or what we're looking for. And the second question is, how do I go about producing one of these things? So I want to kind of start over here, talk about how I find it. And this is all suggestion. You do not have to do these things in the exact same way or approach. There are some people who outlines don't work for. There are some people like me who I find them very useful. So how you go about in the writing process will depend on who you are, how you approach things. But generally, I just want to share what I find useful when approaching a paper, how I would approach the paper for this class. And then you can take these suggestions and use them in whatever way works best for you. Because at the end of the day, each one of you is a scholar in your own right who should choose to do whatever it is that works best for you. So that's the background. So first things first, I handed out some paper prompts. You all should have gotten them on the Blackboard. I can email them if anybody didn't. But they are basically just 4 long passages that are all imaginary scenarios in which you have friends arguing about a topic from class, and I'm asking you to tell me who you think is right. So the first step in this writing process is what? Just reading through the prompts. And the first step is pick out whichever one interests you most. There are 4 choices, you write on one of them. Do not write on more than one unless you really want to have your work cut out for you and do twice as much, 3 times as much work. Don't try to talk about all the prompts. Just focus on whichever one interests you the most. So in this case, you've got the first one is about whether folk psychology needs to be rejected entirely because it's a failed science. The second one is the question of whether or not folk psychology terms are the things that could ever be eliminated, or whether they are just completely essential for even describing psychological ideas. The third one is you've got 2 friends arguing about the classical theory. I want you to tell me what one of their arguments against the classical theory of concepts would be, and then say something later on about whether that's a good reason or not a good reason to argue against the classical theory of concepts. And then the fourth one is the exact same thing as the third one, only about the prototype theory of concepts. So that's the first thing, is just you read through, and these prompts, I mean, if you haven't looked at them, the prompts are long. Like each one is like a page, single space by itself. And that should tell you generally included in there is the background of the case. And I also say what it is that I am looking for and how I think it would be useful to structure the paper. So reading this over, read it closely, take into account what you think would be useful about these prompts. Like, look, if I say things in the prompt, like in parentheses, like you might want to try this, you might want to try that, that is just letting you know, like, some ideas about how to approach the paper. All right, so any questions thus far? Questions, comments, concerns, anything? Okay, we're good. All right, so once you've read the prompts and you've picked out the one you like, whichever one it is, and there's not a right answer here, I chose 4 just so you can choose the one you want to write on. You then choose your thesis. This word gets thrown around in every paper writing class or any paper writing you ever have. But what is the thesis? If you were to sum up in a sentence, what is the thesis of a paper? A concise summary of the main points or claims. It's so a concise summary and a focal point. The way to think of it is, think of the thesis not just as summarizing everything that's coming next. It is the thing that everything in the paper is designed to argue. So if you were having a discussion with your friend about what you should have for dinner, and you are arguing you should get tacos, and your friend is arguing that you should get pizza, what is your thesis? What is your thesis of this argument? And this is like an everyday thing, but you can talk about it in terms of a thesis. If you're arguing for tacos, they're arguing for pizzas. Marie says we should get tacos. Yes, that is your thesis. We should get tacos. So in these papers, they are generally designed to have the thesis rather easy to identify what the possible theses are. So in the first one, this case of your friends at Hunter College who are arguing about whether folk psychology is a bad science, there's basically two possible theses. Thesis one, yes, folk psychology is a bad science and should be gotten rid of. Option two, no, folk psychology is a perfectly good science and should not be gotten rid of. Yes, it's bad, get rid of it. It's good, keep it around. The second one is we should folk psychology will be eliminated once we have neuroscience. The other one is no, we need mentalistic terms. Those are your two theses. Three is my friend. This one's a little more subtle because the thesis is basically, is my friend correct that the classical theory is wrong? So your thesis one is, yes, the classical theory is wrong and needs to be gotten rid of. Option two would be, no, the classical theory of concepts is correct and the problems that people point to aren't as bad as they seem. The fourth one, similar sort of thing. Option one, my friend is correct. The prototype theory of concepts is deeply flawed and we need a different view. The other one is, my other friend is correct and the prototype theory has a lot going for it and the problems aren't as bad as they seem. Those are the general options. Now within that, there's wiggle room. There can be things like the classical theory has problems, but it seems like they maybe should be solved, or they could be solved. So therefore, the conclusion to draw is things aren't perfect, but there's reason to be optimistic. But it's basically, you need a single view that you're holding and that everything else is geared towards. So it's not just a matter of describing your own views. It's not just a matter of describing what people have said. It's not just a matter of describing the various studies that have been conducted. It's rather picking a particular claim about the topic and then arguing for that claim. So with the thesis, it's not just saying like, here's a view, full stop. It's rather, here's a view, and in this paper, I'm going to show why this view is good. Or here's a view, there are some issues with it, and this paper will explain what those issues are and why they're such a big problem. So that's what a thesis is. It's the core of everything in the paper. The way you can think of it is almost like, so if you think that there are good and weaker parts of folk psychology, Holland, what you could say is something like, in this paper, I will argue that folk psychology is at its core a generally correct theory. However, it has some flaws that need to be addressed. So that right there would be a thesis. It's a subtle interacting multiple different parts. Other ways you could say things like, the flip side would be, at the end of the day, folk psychology has a handful of things that are correct, but most of it is wrong, and we can preserve those couple of things and throw out the main. So any of that would be a thesis, anything like that. But the way to think of it is almost like the thesis is almost just a one-sentence name of the entire paper in a certain sense, because everything else that happens in your paper is, the goal is just to expand on and explain what that thesis is and how the thesis, why the thesis is correct. So it's almost like with a Russian nesting doll, like it's all there, you're holding the biggest nesting doll, that is the entire thing. But contained within that nesting doll are all the other things you're going to want to say. So in some sense, conceptually contained in your thesis is everything you'll be addressing in the paper, but you just haven't had the time to explain all that subtlety. The rest of the paper is just unpacking that thesis. So before you can figure out really what you want to do, just choosing the thesis. And again, it can be very subtle. It can be very black and white. Like, folk psychology sucks. Everything about it sucks. Let's throw it all out. Like, that is a perfectly fine thesis. Or it can be something like, it's really tough to say what we should do with folk psychology, because if you actually look at the details, it seems like both sides have good views and they perfectly cancel each other out. Therefore, given our current knowledge, we cannot say the case. Just to be clear though, there always has to be a claim at the core. Don't just say, here are some views on this side, here are some views on the other. Instead say, here are some views on this side, here are some views on the other. They cancel each other out, therefore there's no fact of the matter. Or they cancel each other out, so we need more information. Just always make sure there's something that you're arguing for. So everyone on board with theses or theses or however you want to pronounce it. Awesome. So once you do that and you choose the thesis, the next step is outlining. Now, what does outlining look like? It's different for everybody. I can tell you that my approach is I generally grab a yellow legal pad, a pen, and I make like literally start making bullet lists of like paragraph, like literally this. This is what my outlines look like. And instead of just saying thesis, I write in what the thesis will be. And that's just my approach. I personally, I think from years of writing and being stressed about it, I, like everyone else, I hate a blank Word document. I find it appalling and it causes me high amounts of stress. So therefore, instead of starting by looking at a Word document, I either start by typing up an outline on my phone as I walk around, or I take a legal pad and write it out by hand. Because if I have something I can look to, the like existential dread of staring at a blank Word document is a little bit less terrifying. And that's my personal view. If you're somebody whose approach to outlining is just to sit down and crank out a rough draft in full English sentences, then that can be it. If you're somebody who likes brainstorming artwork and like pictures and things, awesome, whatever works for you. But the main goal of outlining is just to figure out what your main reasons are going to be, or in this case, how you see the various parts of the paper fitting together into a whole that covers your thesis. So when you're outlining, you're going to want to cover like, all right, in this paper, I'm going to be discussing, say, the classical theory of concepts. What sort of stuff am I going to need to address to make this clear? Well, if I'm explaining a paper in which I'm arguing the classical theory is wrong, I'm going to have to define certain sorts of things so that a reader would know what I'm talking about. So things I'm going to have to define are like, what's a concept? What's the classical theory of concepts? Also, I'm going to have to talk about one of the problems. Which ones do I want to talk about? Which ones do I think are strong issues? Which ones do I think are weaker? Just getting those creative thoughts flowing and just writing down the sorts of things that you want to bring up in a paper on that topic. And in the outline, and part of the reason I like doing it on a piece of paper is you will write down things that afterwards you're like, that was dumb. And the good news is you can then rip off that piece of paper, curl it up and throw it in a corner, or just delete the whole document. Like, it's really just a fluid, open writing process. If you are packed with time, like really crunched for time and don't have time to really do this, even something like taking 15 minutes and just jotting down what you think would be useful to mention in your paper. Basically, the idea of the outline is it's better to know what your thesis is before you begin instead of just seeing where your paper will take you. There are times that I have written plenty of things where I just start it and see where it takes me. And in certain classes and certain types of topics, that is a perfectly fine way to go. But in a paper that's a reasoned defense of some claim, like you're not going to start trying to argue with your friend about where you're going to have dinner if you haven't even decided where you want to eat yet. Before you can have that argument, you need to know where you want to eat. In the same way, before you can explain to the person reading your paper what it is that you're going to be arguing, you need to know where you're going and what you're going for. So, does that make sense to everyone? Really, the way to think of it, and this is why writing is so hard. It is not a formula like math where if you follow this step and this step and this step, you have good paper. The thing about a paper is the ultimate way to think about it is a paper is I think rather than thinking of it as like producing something, think of it as an exercise in time traveling psychology. Now that might sound crazy, but really what you're doing when you're writing a paper is you are with your hands performing an action that causes little things to appear on a page. And your goal with those little things is that when somebody in the future reads those little things, they have a thought in their head that is the thought in their head that you right now want them to think. So in your case, you want to say the things on your paper that when this future person reads the paper, they are able to see why you think that your thesis is good. So you have to think what they would have to think in order for you to think. You have to think what they would have to see so that they can think what you wanted them to think originally. And this is why paper writing is not easy. We just say you put your ideas down on paper. No, no, no. You have to think about what they're thinking about what you're thinking. And then sometimes you have to think about, like, if I write this sentence, am I thinking the same thing that somebody else is thinking? It's like, how many of you have played the board game Codenames? Have you played this game? It's basically like you have to, it's a fun game. It's very easy with a large group of people, but it's basically just you have to guess how other people will think when they see certain words. It's basically, for anyone who's played that game, paper writing is that, only you're allowed to say more than one word. But that's why paper writing is so difficult and why it doesn't make sense to just say, go write a paper. It's not, it is really, and because of this, there's no right or wrong way to do it, which is both terrifying and liberating. In the same way, like if you want to make your friend mad, you can do it in 1,000 different ways. Some ways of trying to make your friend mad aren't going to work. Some are going to work really well. Others will work in some ways and not in others. Same with a paper. If your goal is to get someone to see why your thesis is correct, there are many ways to do that well. There are many ways to do that poorly. And it's just a matter of finding a way that works for you. So, and that's what the outline is to try to help yourself find that way of doing it. Yeah, I think Codenames is a very fun game. So anyone who finds that a useful metaphor here. All right. Any questions on the paper writing process? Like the actual sit down we've got up to outlining. Now, what are you outlining? What does a good paper look like? Now, there is not a concrete answer to what a good paper looks like. I have gotten good papers that were written in a way totally unlike anything I'd ever seen. I've had other ones that were written completely differently and are equally good. I've also had ones that stuck pretty closely to my game plan that the parts just didn't ever fully come together. So what I'm going to do right now is just, or what's up here is my way of approaching a paper and the way I would think about approaching the prompts that I have given you all. So basically, the way to think about it with the paper is if your goal is to prove your thesis, always everything in the paper should work towards proving that thesis. And therefore, everything should play one of a handful of roles. Either provide background information as to background information someone would need in order to understand what your thesis is and why your thesis is correct. Other things are anything that would better explain why your thesis is correct or explain why one of your reasons for thinking the thesis is correct is a good reason. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, the first thing is these prompts I've given you are weird and they're designed to not be super, like, they're not just like, so-and-so said this. It's rather literally, imagine you've got some friends and they're arguing. Part of the reason I do this is because it makes it harder to plagiarize. Part of the reason to do it is because for some reason, imagining friends having an argument is generally a more fun topic than just like, what did old dead person number one say and why are they wrong? So in this case, it literally described the case. So I have basically written in my words the cases. Your job first is just to describe it in your own words. You don't just want to Control-C, Control-V what I've done because that doesn't show me you understand the topic. So it's literally just like, one day I walk into the cafeteria, my friends are arguing, so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that. So that's literally all you have to do in this describe the case bit. Why? Because it just sets the stage for everything that's going to come later in the paper. And also, this is important practically for the paper to show me that you've grasped the key parts. If the first paper prompt is something about your two friends arguing about folk psychology versus eliminative materialism, and when you're describing the case, you just go into a lot of detail about the history of Hunter College, that shows me that you didn't fully grasp what the core idea and what I'm looking for in the paper. So the case, describing the case, it can just be a a few sentences that just captures the background of what you're talking about. And then comes the thesis. So in the first one, if it's you've said, my friends are arguing yada, yada, yada. And then the thesis is literally something like, in this paper, I will be arguing that so-and-so is correct and that folk psychology should not be eliminated. Or I will be arguing that so-and-so is correct, and that means folk psychology should be rejected and everything should be done in terms of neuroscience. Now, this right here is the single most important sentence in your paper. And when I say sentence, I mean sentence. A thesis should generally be one sentence long. Yeah, those of you who just typed the text, I will, or in the chat, I will answer that question in 1 second. The thesis is one sentence to maybe two. But literally, you want it so that, and when I'm reading your paper, I know where it's going by the end of the first paragraph. And because philosophy and psychology are complicated topics, you want to make sure that the reader is able to know where your paper's going. Because remember, the goal is to defend your claim. It's a lot easier for a reader to understand your defense if you tell them what the claim is. So just start off, say your thesis. Now, the next thing I have in paragraph 1 is a game plan or a roadmap. And what this is basically, and this is optional, you do not have to include this, but I've always found it useful for my writing, and it can just help structure things. And what is in a game plan is literally 2, 3, 4 sentences in which you just describe what's going to come next in the paper. So it would be something like, to show that so-and-so is correct, I will begin by defining the key terms, concepts, and classical theory. Then I will explain why the classical theory was so popular before turning to some of the problems. The problems I will discuss are yada, yada, and yada, yada. Finally, I will provide additional reasons to think that these problems are real issues. That's what I mean by game plan. This is not necessary, but it can help you structure the paper. All right. So, yes, Holland and Marie. So if those of you who aren't looking at the chat right now, the latest I will accept drafts to read over are, oh no, it says, the thing I have here says that I will read them over as long as I have them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday the 23rd. So basically get them to me by Tuesday the 23rd, and I will not take off, or I will look over drafts. Yeah, it looks like 8 a.m. It's on the prompts, 8 a.m. on the 23rd. So if you get it to me, I will read over drafts. And I'll talk more about this practical stuff later on. But does this first paragraph make sense? If the goal is to answer a prompt on a particular, or answer a question about a particular prompt, start by describing the prompt, tell me the thesis, then tell me what comes next. Now's where the paper, and basically, as I've said, do not feel you have to do this if it just goes against your sensibilities. But very often people ask, what am I looking for? Well, what I'm looking for is the degree of structure and understanding that is displayed in this as one example. So something background, then what your thesis is, and then if you want, the game plan of what's going to come next. All right. The next paragraph I generally find is on a topic in which, in a class like psychology, if you're arguing with your friends about what to have for dinner, and your options are pizza or tacos, you don't have to describe pizzas and tacos because everybody knows what a pizza is and what a taco is. Or at the very least, if you're having that argument, everyone is assumed to know what those things are. If you're having an argument with somebody who's never had pizza, an alien comes down, if you want to explain why you should have tacos, before they can understand, you're going to have to say what tacos are. In the same way, assume that because the goal is, part of the goal is to show me you've understood the topic, one of the things you're going to want to do is show me what the key concepts are and show that you've understood them. A good way of thinking about your paper is assume that you're the prior reading, and by that I mean the paper by Jim Pryor that I gave out on the blackboard. He says talk about it as assume your reader is lazy, stupid, and mean. I generally like to say that it's a concussed, like pretend I got a concussion, or pretend that the person you're talking to is like a drunk 10-year-old. If the drunk 10-year-old can understand what you're talking about, you're talking in the degree of detail and pacing that is going to help you defend your claim in a very reasoned, easy to follow way. So part of what goes into explaining this is giving the background definitions that somebody reading this paper who hasn't taken this class is going to need to understand what you're arguing for. So always assume that when you're writing this paper, you're writing it for somebody who's never taken a psychology class, or at the very least has not taken a psychology of philosophy class. So you can assume certain key ideas, like you can assume that they understand what you mean by mind. They can assume you understand what you mean by brain. But if it's something like concepts, that's a term of art that your whole paper's about. So make sure to define what a concept is. If you're talking about the classical theory, define what is meant by the classical theory. So think of it as, I have this thesis, I am trying to prove this. What background information does someone need to understand why my thesis is right? Well, if I'm using key terms, key ideas, define them. Include a paragraph in which you literally just say something like, in this first paragraph, I'm going to define what concepts are and what the classical theory of concepts is. Or I'm first going to begin by defining what folk psychology is and how it fits into our everyday lives. So that's how I think of the second paragraph, is the key background that's going to be referred back to for the whole paper writing process. Then with these sorts of these particular prompts, the next thing I like to think of, yeah, so Holland says basically don't write like Fodor or Kant. Yeah, so here's the thing that I remember being told in one of my early philosophy classes, which is the people we have you read, we are not giving them to you because they were great writers. Very often, we give them to you because their ideas are so interesting that even though they were crappy writers, we're still giving them to you. So do not try to like follow the Fodor approach. These are people who are trying to do more than just write philosophy. Kant especially, utterly incomprehensible. Try to make it so that anybody can understand. The ideas are so complicated that unless you are a super genius person and you have a lot of sociological factors that lead to you being like a professor who was able to live outside your hometown and write things for your whole life. Basically, make it easier for your reader, because unlike Kant and Fodor, you are not somebody who has a historical following 400 years later or like 30 years later that allows you to get away with writing like crap. So instead, yeah, write clearly, write concisely, and really keep in mind, what is it that I need to do to allow my reader to follow along? So that's 2. 3 is basically, this is the part in which you describe, if you haven't in the background definitions described what it is you're arguing about, you're going to want to say what it is that people are viewing. Or for instance, in the classical concepts view, you're going to want to say, if you haven't defined what the classical theory is here, you're going to want to say something like, this is what the classical theory of concepts is, and here's why people tend to believe it. If you're writing about one of the first 2 prompts in which you're discussing folk psychology, here you're going to define what folk psychology is. And then here you're going to discuss why it is that people believe folk psychology, or what are the arguments that people are giving against folk psychology. So this would be the section in which you say something like, now that we know what folk psychology is, I'm now going to discuss Paul Churchland's argument that folk psychology is like alchemy and needs to be rejected. So that would be, you describe the views that you're going to be discussing. So these 2 kind of go hand in hand, which is why I have these like wishy-washies. But it's basically just, by this point in the paper, you need to describe what it is that you are arguing for, what the key ideas are that you need to understand if that argument's going to make sense. And then finally, why it is that people tend to believe it and what exactly it is that they believe. Once that's done, you can really get onto the core of the paper, which is explaining. So in the 2 concepts topics, this would be the part of the paper in which you start describing what the issues are with the classical theory or the prototype theory. So you've said what the prototype theory is and what its benefits are. This is where you start saying, however, there are problems with the prototype theory, and I'm now going to say what they are. And this is you literally just lay out what the issues are in such a way that anybody is able to follow along. Somebody who's not taken a psych class is, or not taken this psych class, would be able to understand what the issues are that you're trying to raise. So this would be things in which, like if you're going with the classical theory, you could say something like, one problem with the classical theory is typicality effects. So that would be a part here. Another problem would be the missing definition, or the with the prototype theory, you could say the missing prototypes issue. This is the part in which you're really just, and everything up to here is not really going to be creative new ideas in terms of what the content is. Now, the way you present it is going to be wholly your own. But by this point, you're mostly just going to be saying what other people's views are, what these key definitions are, and what problems other people have had with this view. Now, in the case of the folk psychology like prompts, so the first one, in the background definitions, you define folk psychology. Then in this bit, you'd say like why folk psychology is around and why it's so powerful. And then you jump into, however, there have been arguments against it. For instance, Paul Churchland argues yada yada. And then you would just lay out what Churchland's argument against folk psychology is. If you're doing the third prompt, the one about your friends arguing, will folk psychology be entirely replaced by brains? What you could do is in this one, you'd say, here's what folk psychology is. And then you'd say, however, there are others who say that folk psychology is going to be replaced by neuroscience. And then this, you're going to lay out the issues that these neuroscience people have with folk psychology. Again, it's going to be similar sort of thing, but it's basically you lay something out and then you explain what other people's problems with the view are. So that's what we're going to be doing up to here. And now from here, the paper really opens up. And this bit here, it says many options. And it says many options because you have many options. And this is where really where the outlining helps, because there's no right answer to how you approach this. The basic goal is for the rest of the paper to be extra reasons to believe your thesis. So if you think the classical theory is good, then what you're going to want to do here is argue against the problems. You're going to say something like, but while people have pointed to these problems, the classical theory isn't as bad as people think. In this section, I'm going to provide a response to this problem. Or if you dislike the classical theory, in this part, you could bring up another problem. It can be another one someone's talked about, or it could be something that we didn't address in class that just came into your mind. So it can draw on personal experience. You can go, to better illustrate this, another issue is that has to do with the way that children learn concepts. To understand this, I'm going to talk about what it was like to teach my daughter what a cat was. If you can explain that, that's fine. Like that, any approach here works. The key is just explaining to your reader why it is that your thesis is right. And whatever that thesis is, you have to change around your arguments. But some of the things you can do here are things like, here's additional problems this person didn't talk about. Here's a reason why these problems are even worse than anyone talked about. Or here's what an opponent might say, and here's why they're wrong. On the flip side, it could be something like, well, somebody said the classical theory is wrong for this reason. However, they didn't take into account this other thing. So it's very open-ended here. And this is really a matter of just thinking to yourself, well, do I believe in the classical theory of concepts, or do I believe in folk psychology? If I do, why do I believe in folk psychology? Why do I think people like the Churchlands are wrong? Why do I think their arguments against folk psychology are bad? Well, that's what you're going to do in this bit. Once you've laid everything out, you can then provide your own ideas. So that's just the general structuring of the paper. Think about it as background paragraph, key definitions, everything that you need to do to describe the core ideas, what is at issue. And then towards the end, once you've explained what's at issue, what the theories are, why there's problems with them, or why people have thought there are problems with them, then once it's all out on the table, you can really provide your own creative ideas that expand on those problems, respond to those problems, etc. All right. Any questions at this point before I answer Holland's question? And again, this is very open-ended. I'm being kind of wishy-washy here because there is no right way of approaching one of these papers. But this is generally the way I think about it and it's better to think about it conceptually or structurally, or what is this paragraph doing for me? All right, so now does anyone need me to leave this up or can I erase? If nobody says don't erase in 10 seconds, I'm going to erase. So responding to Holland's question while I wait to decide whether I erase the board. Can you use academic sources in addition to the class texts? Yes, you may if you want to. If you do not want to, do not feel you have to. But if you want to bring in outside sources, it can be a great way to better illustrate your point. So for instance, if you're writing about the classical theory and you learn something in your abnormal psychology class that is very relevant to this, feel free to bring it up. Anything that ties in. Just the overall goal is to prove to me that your thesis is correct. So as long as you do something, and as long as whatever you're bringing in helps me, the reader, understand why your thesis is correct, that is an effective way of doing it. So whatever that means to you is on the table. If you wanted to draw a diagram to include, that would be fine. Just about anything goes. So I'm now going to write up some of the key tips and tricks of what separates good papers from bad papers, and then also what I individually do not really care about, and also what philosophy and papers in general do not really care about. So, scroll down. So general tips. This is the word that I find myself writing the most when I'm writing feedback on papers. Signposts or signpost. Now, practically speaking, if you walk along 34th Street and you see a signpost, what is the point of that signpost? What is it doing there? Like, what does this thing do? What is it telling you? And I mean this quite literally. If you're on the street and you saw this, what would you now know? Yeah, where you are, where you're at, what you're doing, like what place you are. That is what a signpost does in a paper. It tells you where in the argument you are. So to think about this, if your whole paper is a reasoned defense where each part is arguing for the thesis, the signpost tells the reader where in that structure they are. So these are sentences like the following. The first thing that I will, or first thing to consider is because this is needed to. So in the concepts paper, it would be something like the first thing however, to begin my paper, or the first thing to consider is what a concept is, because we cannot assess the quality of the classical theory without first understanding what it's supposed to be explaining. That is what an example of a signpost. Another one would be something like, now that we have a definition of a sign or of a concept in hand, I will now blah, blah, blah. So these sentences are really, 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 really useful in a paper in which you're arguing a complex structure where there's lots of different things. Because when you're writing a complex paper like this, one thing you're working against is the human mind. The human mind and human memory are not perfect. So I, reading this paper, might forget, I might have to get up and go to the bathroom, and I'll forget like where I was. And so I'm reading through. Well, if I don't get a signpost, it's going to be harder for me to remember where we're going. Another thing is I'm not in your head. So I don't necessarily know where the argument's going and how you see the parts fitting together. So if you can tell me what this next paragraph is doing and why it's doing that in the overall and the role it's playing in the overall paper, it's going to be much easier for me to understand why your argument in favor of your thesis is a good one. So these signposts are generally something that you should be looking to include at the start of every paragraph, end of every paragraph, either one, just something to allow. The other thing that's really nice about signposts is it helps you in the writing process. If you write this sentence, the first thing to consider is blah, blah, blah. And then then your sibling runs in and bites you on the arm and you're running around the house yelling at your toddler sibling to like knock it off. And then you come back to write and you've forgotten what you were writing on because, you've just been like dabbing off a wound. Well, you then go and you read this and it's like, oh yeah, this is my first paragraph. In this paragraph, I'm giving some definitions. It makes it easier to get back into the writing process. All right, any questions on signposts? All right. Another thing I very commonly say is define your terms. This is the sort of thing where you have to ask yourself, remember, the person reading the paper is in actuality going to be a professor who's going to be reading a lot of papers in a short amount of time and is probably going to get a headache at some point. So because of this, he might not even remember some of the things he teaches because he's so brain dead by the end of it. More accurately, write this as if somebody were not a psychology student or a philosophy student. So give them whatever definitions they need to understand what you're talking about. So you can take for granted that they know what a thing is, or like what a ball is, or what your foot is. But something like what concepts are, define it. So if you're talking about what folk psychology is, define it. And with these definitions, don't just give a one-sentence quote definition from a book. Show me that you really understand it, and more importantly, present enough information that even the dumbest reader would know what you're talking about. So if you say concepts are the building blocks of thought, what exactly does that mean? Say something like, by this, I mean blah, 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 blah. Don't be afraid in these definitions to give a few sentences. And once, like, a definition part could be something like, a concept is typically understood as the building blocks of thought. By this, I mean the following. Our thoughts are generally complex things that we can think of, and we can think of novel thoughts all the time. Part of the reason that this is thought to be possible is because the thoughts are made up of smaller parts, the concepts, each of which corresponds to something out in the world. For example, if I think the thought for the first time, the goose is fat, I have a concept of a goose and a concept of fatness. And what I'm doing is combining those concepts together. That sort of very slow-paced, full explanation is the sort of definition which really shows me that you understand it, understand the material, and is also the sort of thing where if you presented this to your mom, she'd know what you were talking about. And that's the level of clarity we're looking for. So always provide that level of detail. Examples are always good to explain things. So giving examples for definitions, or if you're explaining one of the problems with a certain theory. So instead of just like talking about typicality effects, everywhere. So if you're describing like a typicality effect, don't just define it and give like a nice general definition of like a typicality effect is the fact that individuals will say that certain members of a class are more exemplary of that class than other members. That's true. That's 100% true. That's a good characterization. But it would be better if you then gave an example. to like really hammer it home. You can then say something like, for instance, it's been found that people generally say that apples are a more exemplary fruit than an olive. So that's what providing examples to just really illustrate it. The way to think of it is you are trying to lead your reader to the conclusion that your thesis must be correct and lead any possible reader to that conclusion. So anything that better illustrates your point. Don't also be afraid to reword something in slightly different terms. Something like, if you say a concept is the building block of thought, and then saying something like, by this I mean, or in other words, or this is exactly what I mean. So don't be afraid to define, don't be afraid to give examples, and also say similar things twice in different words. And I said in different words in caps, because don't just repeat yourself. Say something slightly different that will allow someone. So for instance, if you're talking about what a concept is and you've defined it in terms of building blocks, then take another approach. Talk about it in terms of approach it instead of thinking of it as building blocks building outwards. Say another way to approach this is that concepts are the thing, or that whole thoughts refer to entire states of affairs, while concepts refer just to elements of the world or something like that. All right. Anyone need me to pause right now, or can I just now move on to a couple other key little tidbits? These are really the general sorts of useful tidbits for paper writing, and now I just want to talk about the things I don't really care about, and things that you might have been told don't ever do, that for a philosophy paper, or at the very least a philosophy paper in my class, I don't care about. Any questions at this point? And then we'll go on to the logistics on things like due dates, extensions, all that sort of stuff. Any questions right now? All right. So things that generally I don't care about. Now, some of these are things that philosophy papers in general don't care about, and some of these are personal me things. So I'll divide them up, me and philosophy. Philosophy papers do not care about this little word here. We love that word. We love using this word as much as possible. Don't be afraid to use the word I. If you are saying the next thing you are going to do in your paper, don't be afraid to say, I am now going to do this. Why? Because writing it in some other way will be much wordier, much longer, much more complicated. If you're just telling me what you're going to do next, just say the next thing I'm going to do is this. That's totally fine. Short words. Concepts, consciousness, ideas, perception, folk psychology, neuroscience, they are complex topics. You don't need to include extra complex words to make what's already tough even tougher. So if you can get away with the word thing as opposed to the word physical entity, say thing. Shorter words are good. You never have to include long words to make yourself sound smarter. If you are able to explain this stuff, you are smart. You are a hard worker. You understand the material. The ability to explain these hard concepts in simple words is in some ways even more difficult than explaining it in long, complicated words. So don't use long words when a short one will do. If small weight is possible, then don't say extraordinarily massive mass or whatever. Short words, good. Yeah. Yay, short words. Other things in philosophy, I've generally found we don't seem to care much about contractions. Oh, yes, can. Good. Your best friend. I cannot tell you the last time I wrote a paper that did not include the word I in it. It has to be, I'd be willing to say I have never written a philosophy paper that didn't include the word I. The last thing that didn't have I was probably like a government document or some CUNY paperwork. Like, this is everywhere in my writing, and it's very rare to find anyone writing philosophy that doesn't include I. You can probably find it in some long dead people, but these days in an article that someone writes, it's very common. Actually, no, sometimes they use we because the paper's co-authored. But other than that, pronouns, any sort of pronoun, you, he, she, they, them, this, thy, one, anything goes. No need to put like very complicated language. So I, your friend, yes. So now some me things. I don't care about spelling. That's a me thing. Some professors do. I do not. Do not spend any extra time worrying about the spelling if it's causing you like mental distress. If you don't like seeing these little things underneath it, like feel free to change it, but I would never take off points for spelling mistakes. I also will not take off points for grammar. I do not care about grammar. And both of these cases, yeah, so you can use contractions. Those are okay. And that's generally a philosophy thing in general. It can be conversational. It's up to you. So Holland, I mean, generally someone would say, like, I've seen plenty of papers where in the middle of like a professionally published paper, instead of saying something like, they'll be describing a psych study. So it'll be something like subjects, sometimes someone, instead of saying subjects cannot tell the difference, they'll say like subjects can't tell the difference between blah, blah, blah. And in this case, in this paper, if you want to write it more conversationally, that's fine. I will not take off for those sorts of style things. So if that's your preferred writing method, but don't feel if you're somebody who likes to write formal that you have to write in a conversational way. It's really open-ended of what approach works best for you. Grammar, again, I don't care about general grammar rules. What I do care about is that I know what you're talking about. So if it's the sort of thing where your grammaticality is so bad that I have no clue what you're talking about, like according to a stickler for grammar, I don't know who I gave it to. A stickler for grammar would hate this sentence because it's got a preposition at the end, and this should probably be whom. And the way you should say this is, I don't know to whom I gave it, which just sounds pompous as hell. So this sentence like this, I don't care. But if you said this, I, you, up, green, like, I have no idea what that means. IU up green is not a sentence of English that I'm going to be able to figure out. So I do care about grammar insofar as, like, it makes sense. But in terms of the logistical, like, this stuff, there are people out there who care. I'm not one of them. I'll never take off points for that. Other tidbits and things. Pages. Now, what do I mean by pages here? I mean the number of pages. I gave you a page suggestion. That is only a suggestion. It is my best estimate for how many pages it will take you to answer the prompts without repeating yourself too many times. So if you're somebody who is, if you're somebody who writes a one-page paper, that means that you probably didn't say enough to answer the prompt. If you wrote a 25-page paper, there's a good chance that you're just repeating yourself and adding in a lot of unrelated topics. However, If you write a 7-page paper and the prompt says 4 to 6, I will not take off points so long as you're within, like if you go to 7 pages because you're being extra detailed, great. If you turn in a 3-page paper because you are super clear, super concise, everything makes sense, great. If you turn in a 30-page paper in which you don't repeat yourself, you just provide an in-depth analysis of every single argument that's ever been given against the classical theory of concepts and why every single one of those arguments is bad, and you never repeat yourself. Everything is perfect. It's streamlined. It's just a lot. I will never take off points for that. I do not care about page numbers except insofar as these are suggestions to you. So if you are worried like about cutting down page numbers, don't worry about it. There are many times in your life where that will matter. There are many people in the world who really care about it. I'm not one of them, and I will let those people deal with those things. Citations. I am also one of the people who just give me a URL. If you use outside sources and it's probably because you found something super cool and interesting. So if you're going to cite it, just tell me where you got it. I want to be able, if you find a cool psych study that you heard about in another class, I want to read it. If you found a cool news story, I'm going to want to read it simply because I'm going to find it interesting. Also, if the plagiarism gods come down from on high and say, did this person plagiarize? I just want something to be able to show them. But I don't really care if down at the bottom you've got this page and blah, 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 MLA, Chicago. I don't give a crap. Whatever you want to do. If you know you want to go into academia or you want to go into law and you need to practice your citations, go ahead, practice. I will not be caring if you mess up the periods and the commas. But if you want to practice for your own sake, feel free. Again, if you want to use outside sources, feel free, but you do not have to. Also, if you're just citing something from class, I really don't care if you include a citation for it. Like if it's just the readings from class and you're too lazy to write a works cited page, don't bother. I'll be able to tell I've done the readings too. So, citation, spelling, punctuation, drafts. So, logistically now, any questions on these sorts of things or any questions on things that people have? Sentences per paragraph, paragraphs per paper. Generally, there is no correct answer to how many sentences should there be in a paragraph. Well, there is a correct answer. The correct answer is however many there need to be. Sometimes it's 1 sentence. Sometimes it's 40 sentences. What you want to do is use paragraphs as your way of signaling a change in topic. So if you've been describing what the classical theory of concepts is, and now you're changing to arguments against, make it a new paragraph. But it doesn't matter how many sentences are there. Same with paragraphs per paper. You can write a kick-ass 3-paragraph paper. You can write a kick-ass 97-paragraph paper where each paragraph is 1 sentence if that's how it flows best for you. There's not right answers to these sorts of things. So any questions at this point on any of these little tips and tidbits and that sort of stuff? All right, now let's talk the logistics. Paper drafts, paper comments, everything like that. The final paper draft is due the day before spring break. If, however, something comes up and you needed an extension, reach out to me. The world, COVID vaccines are going around, but we're still a lot closer to the world ending than the world being perfect. So if something comes up for you, reach out. I'm going to be very lenient with these extensions. Honestly, if you come to me and are like, I started my paper and I'm really working hard on it, and honestly, it's just that I think I will turn in something better if you give me an extra 2 days, I will almost certainly say, yes, have the extension. Papers are not supposed to be for some of us, including myself, sometimes writing is the most miserable thing in the world. It very often is. It's strange that I choose to write for a living. because I very often hate doing it. But because of this, anything that makes it a more enjoyable experience. If the deadline is making it less enjoyable for you, reach out to me. We'll give you a new couple more days. I want this to be as like the topics and the fact that you have to sit down in front of a Word document at all are stressful enough. So anything else to make it less miserable for you, just reach out, let me know. Now drafts. The way drafts work are you send me something, I will download it, I will put it in a PDF, and I will go through with a little red pen on my iPad and put a whole lot of comments in it. These comments are always going to be suggestions of how I think you might make something clearer, what I think makes sense, what I think doesn't make sense. They are suggestions. If you think I'm full of crap, then just ignore them. Also, another thing to keep in mind, I will never, ever, ever, to the best of my ability as a human being, where I'm a human being who's biased like every other human being, I will never take off points for disagreeing with your conclusions. I can tell a good paper even if the thing it's arguing for is the opposite of what I would be arguing for. It comes down to how well you argue it, not what conclusion you reach. So like, if I love the classical theory of concepts and you love the prototype theory, I can still tell if it's a very good prototype theory paper. I will never take off points for that sort of thing. All right. With drafts, same as with the final copies, just make sure your name is on the document, just so I can easily sort it. And if it's a sort of thing where you only have one paragraph done and you want me to read it over, send it my way. If you wanted me to read the entire draft only when it's done, wait till you're done. If you want to send me half of a paper, if you just want to ask me one sentence, if at any point you want to meet by Zoom and talk about your paper individually, talk about papers generally, you just want to run an idea by me, something like, hey, professor, I'm thinking about doing this. Do you think that makes sense? Or I'm thinking about bringing this outside source. Do you think that would work? Anything that you want to ask me, feel free. And with the drafts, I usually am able to turn them within 24 hours. So if you get me a draft and you haven't heard back from within 24 hours, feel free to bother me again. Just email me a copy of the paper, send it my way, and that's that. I will be talking much more about the logistics and deadlines as we get closer to 2 weeks from now when they're due. But any other questions right now on anything paper related? All right. If there's nothing more, then class is over. I've ranted enough about papers. Hopefully this was helpful to some of you. If nothing else, some of you were able to ignore me and get some shopping done. Whatever works best for you. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm going to stick around for a couple minutes now, and I'll just give like a preview of what we'll be doing the next few classes. I'm glad to hear that it was helpful for those who it was helpful for. All right. So the last thing we're going to be, or the last bit of this first half of the class, we're going to be talking about modularity of mind. It is unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your views, it's more Jerry Fodor crap. I generally find it easier Fodor to read than some of this other stuff. It's earlier Fodor, so it's a lot of the stuff like generally with theorists, they're young, very often like it's an unfortunate fact about modern academia that the best work someone does is their earliest work because it's the most clearest and most concise. And then as they get older, they're asked to write a lot more. So what they write is a lot less well proofread and everything else. So modularity of mind is earlier Fodor, and it's basically what it's talking about is perception versus cognition. Now, what I want to be talking about in this last bit is just whenever you go into psychology, there's assumed in the background, there's this difference between thinking and perceiving in some sense, where there is the main mind, the conscious mind, there's something that our main thoughts happen in. And then there's perception, which is the information that comes to you through your sense organs. Things like, you see something. And so part of the background in a lot of psychology is asking, how can we tell these apart? What is the relationship between them? And so what we're going to be looking at is these days, a lot of people assume in psychology that we can basically divide the mind up into a cognitive system, which deals with thought or deals with reasoning, deals with our everyday things, and then perception, which is these specialty systems which basically operate on their own, separate from the central mind, and provide input to cognition. So what we're going to be talking about is what the reason is that a lot of people think that this is how the mind is organized. And then also briefly discussing, well, what are the implications for this? So things like these days, how does thinking work or cognition work? Well, very few people have any idea about this one. Like, why is it that our train of thought goes the way it does? That's a very open question. But one of the real strengths of psychology in the past 30 years is perceptual sciences have become really, really sophisticated. So it's very rare that, like, you can now mathematically tell me what I will perceive if I am presented with a certain sort of image, and what it is that I'm perceiving and how I perceive it and how it is that organisms actually get information about the external world through their eyeballs, through their ears. That is the sort of thing that is lending itself to some very accurate mathematical calculations. So what we're going to be talking about for the next couple classes is just why think that these two are separate systems, and what are the features of perception that we can use to say it's different from cognition, and why is it worth dividing things in this way. So that's what we'll be talking about next class, and officially the 2 classes after, but who knows if we're actually going to talk about much stuff the class before spring break. So that's all I have to say today. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to email, and I will see you all on Wednesday. All right. Have a great one, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.